Hello and welcome back to the Genealogy Kickstart series. In this lesson, we'll look at how to begin recording and organizing your genealogical information. You have more ancestors than you've probably ever really stopped to think about. Each generation doubles the number of direct ancestors. For example, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and 32 third great-grandparents. Within just a few generations, you already have 62 ancestors, and that's not including all of the siblings, cousins, and other family members. There's simply too many people to keep track of all of this information in your head. Instead, you need to find a way to record and organize this information. The easiest way to do this is by using Pedigree Charts and family group sheets. These are forms that allow you to record the names and the dates and places associated with them. When you're new to genealogy, usually your first pedigree chart starts with you on line 1. Then you record the information for your parents, your father on line 2, and your mother on line 3. It's important to be consistent with how the names are entered on the forms so that you don't accidentally mix up the family lines. For example, to record the information for your paternal grandparents, your father's parents, you would put your grandfather on line 4 and your grandmother on line 5. To record his parents, you would put his father on line 8 and his mother on line 9. You would follow this pattern for each of the lines on the form, both for your paternal side and your maternal side. As you can see, the pedigree chart forms only have room for a limited number of generations. What do you do when you want to record information further back in time? The very first chart that you begin with becomes chart number 1. Then each of the people in the last column gets their own chart. For example, your great-grandfather on line number 8 would become the first person on chart number 2, and then you would trace back from him. Your great-grandmother on line 9 would become the first person on chart number 3, and so forth, so that each person in the last column would have their own chart, and the number of charts grows as your family tree grows. If you have incomplete or missing information, go ahead and leave those portions of the form blank. You're likely to have quite a few blank lines when you're first getting started. This is fine because these lines allow you to identify what information is missing and what you can use to target new research later in time. We'll discuss that a little bit more toward the end of this lesson. For each person on your pedigree chart, enter the name and the dates and places associated with their birth, marriage, and death. These are key events which often generate records, referred to as vital records. It can be helpful to enter the last name in uppercase. For example, in the name John Smith, Smith is spelled with all uppercase letters. This isn't required, but it can make it much easier to spot a surname that you're looking for later on a completed form. Dates are entered using a certain format. The day, the month either spelled out or abbreviated, and the full year. If you use the number in place of the month, this can possibly lead to confusion, as different parts of the world arrange the numbers in a different order than we may be used to. So no matter how it appeared in the original record, by recording it in this way, it avoids any possible confusion later on. Locations are also entered in a certain formula, from the smallest geographical unit to the largest. For example, the city or town the county, the state, and if need be, the country. This can be used no matter what country by following the pattern of the smallest geographical unit to the largest. And don't forget to include the county or its equivalent from another country. This is because many records are created and kept at the county level. But keep in mind that county boundaries may change over time. A large county, once it reaches a certain population level, may be divided into smaller counties, but the records don't move. They stay with the original county in that courthouse. So sometimes you need to do a little bit of research to determine which county a town or city was in at the time the record you're looking for was created. For married women, use their maiden name on the form. This avoids any possible confusion later on between her lines and her husband's. A pedigree chart usually only records the direct biological lines. If you want to identify a different relationship, such as a step-parent or an adoptive parent, it's much easier to do this using the family group sheets that we'll talk about in a moment. As I said before, if there's information that you don't know, it's okay to leave that part of the form blank until you discover that information. However, if you have a rough idea, go ahead and record it, but make sure that it's clear that that information at this point is uncertain. For example, if you have a record that provides someone's age, you may be able to estimate what year they were born. When you record that, use something such as about or circa before the date so that you know that this information is not verified yet, but at least gives you a starting point to work from. The same if you know something occurred before a certain date. For example, if you found a burial record that told the date of the burial, but not the date of death, this will allow you to have a point to start working backwards from. This can also be used if there is a date range for which an event likely occurred. For example, if you have a will that was entered later into the probate, you have the date that the will was recorded and you have the date that it was entered into the probate court. By entering this date range, you've narrowed the window to look for the date of the death. This can also be done with locations. For example, if you don't know the exact city or town in which an event occurred, go ahead and record what information you do know, such as the county or even the state. This at least gives you a starting point to work from. It can be very helpful to start out using pencil until the information is verified. It's much easier to erase pencil than it is to scratch out and try and change information in a very small form, such as a pedigree chart. Now let's take a look at the family group sheet. As you saw on the pedigree chart, there's only a limited amount of space, and you can only record the name and information for each of the parents. This can be helpful if you're trying to see multiple generations at once, but there's not enough room to record the names of everyone who may have been part of that family group, such as all of the children born to each of those couples. To do that, you would use a family group sheet for each one of those couples. You would enter the names and information for the father and the mother, and for each of the children who were born to them. There's also room to list the names of any additional spouses that they may have had. This can be helpful if you're trying to research them at different points in time. In this example, Clarence and his wife, who went by Blanche, divorced in 1924 and quickly remarried. If I'm looking for records for Clarence after that 1924 date, I would be looking for him associated with a woman named Clara rather than Blanche. And if I'm looking for records for her, I would be looking under her new name of Stosh rather than her maiden name or her previous married name of Allen. It's also a good idea to list the children in birth order, from oldest to youngest. This can be helpful in a number of ways. For example, it may allow you to see how the family moved around in different times. By listing where and when each of the children was born, you can trace the movements of the family. It can also be helpful when you're looking in census records. Many census records will list the children in birth order. This will allow you to match up the family unit that you see in the family group sheet with that in the census record by being able to see the same order of the children and which children may not have been born yet in that census year. There's also room to record the information for each of the children's spouses. This is particularly helpful with the daughters because once they get married, their records are usually under their new surname rather than their maiden name. Just as with the pedigree chart, the names, dates, and places are recorded in the patterns that I showed you previously. Again, use the maiden name for each of the married women and identify the additional spouses for the parents. If there are children born to that new couple, separate them by creating a family group sheet just for them, which will show the biological children with each couple and help you distinguish between the different relationships. By placing the children with the birth parent on the forms, you can see what the different relationships might have been. For example, between full siblings, half siblings, and step siblings who may all appear together in the same record for that household. And once again, it can be very helpful to place the children in birth order. In Lesson 5, we'll look at another method for recording this information. Pedigree charts and family group sheets are good if you only have a limited number of generations or families that you're recording. Once you start growing your family tree and start to have many more people to keep track of, it's easier to use other methods that we'll discuss later in a future lesson. As you begin looking for information about your ancestors, it can be helpful to do so by setting specific research goals. Instead of just doing broad general searches to see what records might show up, instead it's more effective to set the goal of identifying where each piece of information may be located. First, start with the facts that are missing. These are those blank lines that I mentioned before that will appear on your pedigree chart and family group sheets because you don't yet know that information. Then think of it in the form of a question. For example, when was my grandmother born? Next, think of all the different types of records that may be available that can help you find that information. For a birth date, or an age from which you can get an estimated birth year, it's likely that there are many different types of records that can be found. If you're lucky, you may find a birth certificate. However, birth certificates are fairly recent. If the person was born before the late 1800s to early 1900s, it may be before birth certificates came to that state. There may be other types of birth records available, but it all depends on the time and location. Death certificates may have a person's birth information in addition to their death information. Marriage records, such as a marriage license, might contain their age if the couple were required to prove that they were of marriageable age before it could take place. Census records in the United States since 1850 have all asked for the ages of each person in the household. Family history collection items that you may have might also be helpful, such as an old driver's license or a passport. Even an old school yearbook could help. Look to see when the book was published and what grade the child appeared in. From that, you can probably estimate how old they are and approximately when they were born. Military records may have asked for an age or even an exact birth date. For example, a draft registration from World War I, World War II, or even the Civil War may have asked for their age or birth date. This was because only men within a certain age range were required to register. Many other legal records may also have their age. Even a passenger manifest may list the ages of each of the passengers aboard. This is an example of a death certificate from 1931. In addition to the death information, it also lists the exact birth date and the age of the individual. However, always be careful when using this type of information. It's probably pretty reliable for the death information because the record was created close to the time of death and likely was recorded by someone who witnessed the death. However, the information about the birth is only as good as the knowledge of the person who gave it. That person is usually referred to as an informant. In this particular case, the informant was Maynard's third wife. He didn't know her until he was much older, so she never met his parents or knew about his early life. When the death occurred, they were on vacation, so she couldn't even consult other family members. As you can see, for the information about his parents, she knew his father's name, but she didn't know where he was born, and she had no knowledge of his mother's name or where she was born. So the birth information here can be used as a clue, but don't take it as a fact until you can find other pieces of information to verify it. This leads us to our next exercise. Find a pedigree chart form online and print it out. Or if you don't have easy access to a printer at the moment, you can make your own following the pattern that you saw on the previous slides or ones that you can find online. There are a number of different websites that have free forms that you can download and print out. For example, on Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, and on the website for the National Genealogical Society, as well as many others. The easiest way to find a form is to do a search in a search engine such as Google. Just enter the terms Pedigree Chart form, and you'll find many to choose from. Do the same to find a family group sheet form. Then begin recording all of the facts that you know or that you've discovered from the scavenger hunt exercise in the previous lesson. Once you have some of the information down, look to see those blank lines and start thinking about what types of records might be available that has that information. Next time, we'll look at some of those records. So please join me next time for lesson 3.